Thank you very much, Simon, and good morning, everyone. Elder, I'm very appreciative of your introduction this morning, and want to pay my respects to the Algonquin people on whose traditional lands we are now meeting. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to say a few words this morning about the all-important subject of water. I'm going to talk to you today about something which sounds extraordinarily dull. So the title is Governance Matters. And I'm going to try to make this sound really interesting to all of you because I'm convinced that as we look at how much money and effort has been put into providing communities with clean water, running water, drinking water, swimming water, and no, I have no intention of running the Rick Mercer video once again for all of you. Water is really such a part of our lifeblood and identification as a country. And when you consider how much emphasis we've given to it and how critical water is to our identity as Canadians, to who we are as a country, who we are as a people. It is, as Gordon has said, and I'm delighted when the person who's giving the prayer actually steals my thunder in my speeches. It's good. We have 136 communities as of this morning's tour of the internet who are on a boil water advisory. And we have some communities that have been on a boil water advisory for over 20 years, which when you think about it is both remarkable and disgraceful. I mean, how could this be? How could this happen? So what I want to do is do one other thing as well, and that is to relate what is happening in Canada to what is happening around the world, and also try to get all Canadians to recognize that this is our problem. This is not somebody else's problem, it's our problem. One of the great challenges that exists in politics today, or in public policy, and I'm not here to give a partisan speech at all. Anyone here who's reporting back to the governments in Canada and Ontario, rest assured, there's going to be no juicy denunciations here. The denunciations will take care of themselves. Simply outlining the facts is enough to make us realize that something has to give here, to go from, in the words of the conference, to go from knowledge to action. But one of the great challenges in politics is that there are what I call us problems, and then there are what I call us and them problems. Us problems are problems that all Canadians can identify with as being their problems. Taxes is a good example. We're all united together in a feeling about taxes. It affects every single one of us. What happens in the broader economy is an us problem. What happens in healthcare is an us problem. Although, to be fair, it affects people with my color hair more than many of the young people that I had breakfast with this morning. But it's still something that we all can connect with as an us problem. One of the key challenges for the country is that there are some issues that have become us and them problems. So that, for example, the condition on reserves is seen as, well, that's somebody else's problem. It's far away, doesn't affect me, doesn't affect my community. It's a far, long issue away. I might think about it morally occasionally, but I don't think about it as being a me problem, an us problem. But when you consider that, speaking of healthcare, that the single biggest advance in healthcare around the world, and starting in industrial Britain in the middle of the 19th century, when a guy called Sir Edwin Chadwick, who became sort of the public health guru of his time, they clearly identified that drinking water and how sewage was treated, and they are connected, as the elder has said, and where it's treated, obviously connected to where the drinking water goes, actually was at the time the biggest health problem, biggest health issue affecting a country that was in the middle of this industrial revolution where people were being increasingly crowded together in large cities. And so the biggest leap in longevity, the biggest single improvement in the health of that country was the introduction of a system of clean drinking water, treated drinking water. It took another several generations to move to indoor plumbing, but these were all things that were recognized as essential for people's health. And it wasn't the number of doctors that were graduated. It wasn't all sorts of other things that you can look at as being indicators of public health. It was actually the health of the population being improved by the decision to make investments in infrastructure. And this is true now today in all of the developing world. How do we improve the actual prospects for people in terms of their health? We do it by dealing with the major causes of disease, and one of the major causes of disease is illnesses that are born by water that is not healthy, that is not treated, that is not safe. But it would be a mistake to think that when we talk about ensuring that we have clean water, that this is a technical issue. And I say this looking out at an audience that I know must be at least 50% engineers. And I hate to be the one to tell you that the problem is not really an engineering problem. It has technical aspects to it, yes. But this is an issue of governance. It's an issue of responsibility, and it's an issue of capacity. And whether we are looking at our aid programs in countries that have deep poverty, long histories of colonialism, a lack of capacity, a lack of education, a lack of training, a lack of means to run systems, going back to the history of aid programs post-Second World War, and going even long before that in the history of colonialism itself, which was just really a huge aid program in a sense. The aid-giving countries have spent billions, hundreds of billions of dollars on infrastructure. So the issue is not infrastructure. The issue is the capacity of the countries themselves to run and manage the infrastructure. How many times have people gone back to aid projects that were started 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago and seen a museum of white elephants across the country that didn't work and couldn't operate and didn't function? They were designed in London or New York or somewhere else. They were dropped from the sky onto a village or a community or even a city. There was probably something in the machinery that was completely incompatible with the environment around it, so it couldn't function after 2 or 3 years. There were huge issues with training, huge issues with management of the system. How do you develop a capacity within that country to actually run? Is there an operating budget? Is there the financial management? Is there the administrative management? Is there the human resource management and capacity to run that system? That is the story of foreign aid when it comes to building infrastructure. Prior to that, it was the story in the history of colonialism. Oh, and by the way, it's the story of Canada. We don't think of ourselves as a settler country. For the most part, we don't have that perspective. Aboriginal people have that perspective because they know that's what happened. But we don't think of it that way. And it's only if we start thinking of it that way that we begin to understand that the structures and governance that we have in place today to address these problems is wrong. It just doesn't work. And so I'm not here to say that the federal and provincial governments have to spend another X billion dollars. Or let me put it another way. I'm not here to say that if they do that, that will solve the problem, because it won't. Yes, there's more money that needs to be spent in infrastructure. Yes, when you look at the litany of inadequacies in terms of housing, in terms of education, in terms of roads and access to roads, you can see the physical gap. But the physical gap is only part of the gap. The real problem is a lack of respect for self-government itself, and the need for us to look at ways in which power can be devolved and acknowledge that the current structures that we have for delivering the systems don't work. What good does it do? And I speak with some experience here. And when I was Premier in the early 90s in Ontario, it is admittedly a long time ago, I was having breakfast this morning with some of the young people at the conference, and I felt like a bit of a sort of a museum piece. You know, they said, you were Premier? I have no memory of your being Premier. Well, it was because they were very young. They were 2 or 3 at the time. They obviously couldn't remember when I was Premier. Although if they went to primary school, they would remember getting an extra week off. And the days were thankfully named after me, and still live forever in people's memories. I had spent the 80s as the opposition leader traveling. I spent a lot of time traveling in the far north, and I visited a lot of communities. And I was struck, to put it mildly, by the poverty and by the way in which these communities were not really part of the life of our province. They were not really being integrated into Ontario. In the far north of Ontario, there are 25 communities that are still remote communities that have no access to roads outside wintertime. The only way you can get in there is they're all fly-in communities. And the federal government was supposed to be responsible for them, but frankly, the federal government was leaving the field, doing as little as possible. So I said, we decided as a cabinet that we would in fact include the First Nations in all of our infrastructure programs, if they wanted to apply for a grant for water, for whatever it would be, we would move forward on that front. And we did it. And then in '93, when the government changed, we signed an agreement with the federal government to jointly fund those programs. And so we began a program of introducing water treatment as a fundamental right of those communities. And we thought we were on the right track. But the problem is that we did not match, and I say this being very, very candid, we did not match the infrastructure decision with the capacity issue. And it hasn't really been done since. So we don't have the systems of governance in place to ensure that actually once you've introduced the water treatment technology, that you will then be able to maintain the system and you'll be able to keep it running and keep it functioning. And for those of you who are from big cities, this is not actually different from what you are about to face. Because when the federal government introduced its new regulations and said, oh, look at us, we're introducing the toughest, strongest regulations ever with respect to the treatment of water and the treatment of sewage and the protection of the environment. But we have a national governance problem as well, because the cities do not have the means and do not have the financial capacity to actually be able to address the new regulations which are coming in force. And so that's why the largest piece of furniture in the office of every mayor in the city, in the country, is a begging bowl. Talk to a mayor for more than 5 minutes, and what will they talk about? They don't have the money to do what they need to do. They need more cash, whether it's for transit, whether it's for infrastructure, whether it's for water, whatever it may be. And this governance issue will continue to exist, whether it's a Liberal government next or an NDP government next or a Conservative government next, and regardless of who's in power at Queen's Park. There's a governance gap between what we're asking cities to do and what their financial capacity actually is. And so my pitch to everyone is the challenge that the cities are facing are going to be facing even more so in the future is exactly the same challenge that the reserve system has been facing from its very inception. And I always find it fascinating in talking to Canadians about this issue. So many people will come up to me after the speech and say, well, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but, they're really, haven't we been spending a lot of money on these communities, and do we have anything really to show for the money that we're spending? And I say to them, I said, look, if you look per capita, the amount of money that we're spending in this community is less than the amount of money that all levels of government are spending in Toronto or any other city. Look at how much we spend on education, look how much we spend on all the programs that are in place in cities, add up what all the governments are spending, and you'll come up with a much higher per capita number than you would on any reserve. Guaranteed. When the treaties were signed across Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, the communities that exist in the north of those provinces did not get access to resource revenues. The government of the time didn't say, we're going to sign a treaty with you, oh, and by the way, you're going to get a fair share. We're going to try to develop up north here, and when we do, you're going to get a share of all the money that we develop, because after all, the land was yours when we got here. We didn't come here and find nothing. You were here, so you were here first. You should get a claim on that resource revenue. We haven't done that. Provinces haven't done that. Federal government hasn't done that. Some of the premiers say, we'll never do it. We will never share our revenue with any other stakeholder. Well, First Nations are not a stakeholder. First Nations are First Nations, people who were here first. And so we need to create the governance structures, the revenue streams, the capacity, and one more thing, the regional cooperation among First Nations. The Indian Act is guilty of many things, but one of the things that it's guilty of is dividing First Nations themselves. In creating the reserve structure, it has ensured competition from communities of 400, 500, 600 people, and has not created a governance structure equal to the task of governing. And that's what has to be negotiated, and that's why self-government is so critically important. So as important as water is to us, as important as clean air is to us, we have to try to understand that it's going to take going from the knowledge that we have, the new technologies that are available, to get to the action required is going to require real imagination when it comes to governance. And the governance imagination that is required is not a governance imagination that is only required for First Nations people who live, quote, far away. It's a governance imagination that's required of the whole country. The trouble with our federal system is that it needs constant repair. It's like a water system. It needs maintenance, and it needs to be repaired and changed. And we have to understand that the responsibilities of local communities are growing, but their capacities are not growing to match those responsibilities. So a tour across the north of this country would find boil water advisories not because there are no water treatment systems in place. They would find water treatment systems that simply aren't functional, that aren't working, that aren't adapted to meet the needs of those communities, and that don't have the people and the governance structures around them to actually maintain them. It's not that governments haven't shelled out billions of dollars. They have. But they haven't matched that spending with the governance imagination that's required to run better systems. And that's where we all collectively need to give ourselves a shake. Because really, there's nothing more tragic than to see communities that are in the middle of the most pristine circumstances one can imagine, not able to drink the water that is right next to them because it simply hasn't been treated properly. It doesn't have the pumping systems required. It doesn't have the treatment systems required. And it doesn't have the infrastructure that's required to make it work. And to see people in one community of Martin Falls with a record of like 2 million bottles consumed over the space of a 20-year period. I mean, bottle after bottle after bottle of drinking water. You know what the cost of that is? Bringing it up, putting it in crates, putting it on a plane, flying it in. It's preposterous. And some people say to me, it's almost as if it was a third world situation. And I say to them, no, it's not almost as if, it is. We need to wake up as a country and appreciate the fact that, and I don't say this to be mean-spirited of Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper once said that Canada has no history of colonialism. He's absolutely wrong about that. Our entire history is a history of colonialism. That is what our history is. And building a post-colonial world is as important for us as it is for any developing country going. We are a developed country, and we are a developing country. And we have to understand these inner contradictions in who we are in order to be able to deal with them effectively. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I look forward to hearing, to being on the panel and hearing some commentary, and look forward to questions from all of you. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's a wonderful chance for me to express some thoughts. I look forward very much to hearing about your successful conference. Thank you so much. Miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ray. You mentioned that one of the solutions is effectively devolving responsibility of governments so that they can properly self-govern. And over breakfast, you shared some stories about how some communities, they're vandalizing their own systems. And so I'm wondering if, even if we do, or if power or responsibility is effectively devolved, it still seems like there's some underlying issues. Would you be able to comment on that?
Well, I think there are underlying issues in every Aboriginal community. There's conditions of deep poverty. There's conditions of great hardship. There's a lot of social problems that everyone reads about and hears about, including violence and suicide and the major addiction problem in northwestern Ontario, where the prescription drug addiction issue is still the single largest health problem that exists right now. So that's why I say it's about governance. Governance includes something as simple as policing and security. Governance is something which actually gives the communities the capacity to deal with the internal problems that might exist in any community. But it's important, I think, to recognize overall that the breakdown in the systems that currently exist are breakdowns that could take place in any system. The problem is, how do you create systems of maintenance that will allow those systems to function? No machine runs forever without a problem. Every machine breaks down. What do you do when the machinery breaks down? What do you do when you need parts to replace it? There's a couple of other technical problems that I think need to be looked at. One is that almost every system is built as a one-off in each community, frequently by different companies, because they're the result of a separate competition. So you have government rules say that there has to be an RFP, and the RFP has to produce a certain result, and here's the standard that they have to meet. So you can get one RFP in one community, 60 miles away you can get another RFP in another community with a completely different system in place. So that complicates the matter of maintenance. So you say, well, wouldn't it be better to do a regional RFP or a broader RFP that would have consequences for everybody? So those are all examples where there's not going to be a perfect solution, but we have to find some changes in governance and in increases in self-government that are going to allow people to take more responsibility for the systems that they're being asked to operate. And then find ways of not only training people, but keeping people who are trained working within the system. And there are ways in which that can be done. When you talk to First Nations people, they'll talk about how regionally that can be done, but that it's going to take a different structure than the one that we currently have in place.
Sorry, I thought it was just important to add that I think I must apologize because I realized that I said they're vandalizing their systems. It's like that kind of the us, them that you talked about. When I realized that there's people even in our own cities that vandalize our systems, but they only use spray paint in it, they can't get inside.
It's not an exclusively Aboriginal issue, but I think we do have to be, I don't think there's anything wrong with having a candid conversation about what are the issues that are being faced in communities that make it difficult for people to do the things that we say needs to be done. And I think we have to be very creative in the solutions that we try to find, so that you're not looking at just sort of painting a one big political brush and say this is the answer, but to identify what the problem is. And what I feel is the problem is it's systems of maintenance and systems of training and systems of management that are the critical problem. It's not only the fact that governments aren't prepared to spend enough money. Governments have already spent a lot of money. The question is, how do you create a greater capacity for self-government, which presumably one hopes will do a better job than what we have in place today.